The grief had a texture. For 3 years, it had been a thick woolen blanket that Sarah Jensen pulled over her head each morning and only shed in the ragged, dreamless hours of sleep. It was heavy, insulating her from a world that had kept spinning after hers had stopped dead. 1,095 days since her daughter, Amelia, had walked into Northgate High for a Saturday morning basketball practice and never walked out. 1,095 days of looking at the same unchanged bedroom, a museum of a life interrupted. The police had called it a runaway case at first. A 16-year-old girl, a minor disagreement with her mother the night before over a curfew. It was the easiest box to put it in. But Sarah knew her daughter. Amelia was the sun in human form, a whirlwind of goofy laughter, paint-stained fingers, and fierce loyalty. She would not have left her best friend, Maya, without a word. She would not have left her dog, Buster, whose whines still echoed in the silent house. And she would not have left her mother. The disagreement had been trivial, forgotten by morning, but it became a stone the investigators turned over and over until Sarah felt its weight in her own gut. Eventually, the runaway theory frayed and tore, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of a vanishing. The investigation intensified, then cooled, then went cold altogether. Detective Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weary resignation, had been kind but firm. Without a body, without a ransom note, without a single credible witness who saw her leave the school grounds, there was nothing to follow. The trail dissolved on the damp asphalt of the school parking lot, as if Amelia had simply evaporated into the perpetually gray Oregon sky. Sarah's life became a quiet loop of routines designed to keep the screaming void at bay. Work at the local library, the hushed rustle of pages a balm on her frayed nerves. The long walk home, avoiding the route that passed the high school. Dinner for one. And on weekends, a new, strange ritual. Storage unit auctions. It had started as a distraction, a suggestion from her sister, Karen, to find a hobby, any hobby. It was a peculiar subculture of treasure hunters and resellers, people picking through the forgotten fragments of other people's lives. For Sarah, it was something else. It was a place of lost things. She never bid much, usually just buying the smallest, most neglected units, the ones filled with cardboard boxes of dusty dishware and old clothes. She was not looking for treasure. She was just looking. This Saturday was no different. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a stained tie, stood before Unit 23B. The corrugated steel door rolled up with a screech, revealing a shallow space packed with dusty furniture and sealed plastic totes. It was a standard locker, unremarkable. An overdue payment from a Mr. Thompson, the auctioneer announced, his voice tinny in the cavernous hallway. Looks like we got some household goods, maybe some old-school supplies in those bins. Who wants to start the bidding at $50? Sarah felt a familiar, dull tug of something. Not excitement, but a mild curiosity that was the closest she got to feeling alive. She saw a dusty floor lamp, a stack of chairs, and several large, opaque tubs. It was the detritus of a move or a divorce or a death. A life packed away and abandoned. She raised her hand for the opening bid, and a moment later, with no competition, the unit was hers. It was a small, predictable thrill. She paid the cashier, slid the new lock onto the latch, and decided to come back the next day to sort through her winnings. For a few hours, she would have a task, a puzzle of someone else's past to occupy her mind. The next morning, the air in the storage facility was cold and smelled of concrete and mildew. Armed with gloves and trash bags, Sarah began her work. The furniture was cheap particle board, water-damaged at the base. She set it aside for disposal. Then she turned to the plastic totes. The first held a jumble of old textbooks and binders, their spines cracked. The name Northgate High was printed on several of them. A retired teacher, perhaps. That made sense. Mr. Thompson. The name tickled the edges of her memory, a faint bell ringing in a distant room. She pried the lid off the second tote. It was filled with old clothes, mostly men's shirts and slacks, all smelling faintly of mothballs. At the bottom, however, was a smaller, unsealed cardboard box. She lifted it out. It was lighter than it looked. Inside, nestled among yellowed newspapers from 4 years ago, was a pair of sneakers. Time stopped. The air in Sarah's lungs turned to ice. They were Converse, once white, now scuffed and dirty. But the dirt could not obscure what was on them. On the canvas sides, in fading but still vibrant acrylic paint, were dozens of tiny, smiling sunflowers. Each one was unique, a little burst of yellow and brown painted with a loving, slightly unsteady hand. Sarah's breath hitched, a strangled, painful sound in the silent corridor. She sank to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached into the box. She did not need to touch them to know. She had watched Amelia spend an entire weekend at the kitchen table creating these shoes. Her tongue stuck out in concentration, a smear of yellow paint on her cheek. They were her favorite pair. She had worn them to school that last Saturday. Sarah had commented on them as Amelia was heading out the door, a knot of dread in her stomach because it had been raining. "You'll ruin your artwork," she had said. Amelia had just laughed. "They're shoes, Mom. They're meant to be worn." They were meant to be worn. And here they were, in a box, in a stranger's storage unit, stripped from her daughter's feet. The woolen blanket of grief was suddenly gone, ripped away, exposing her to the raw, freezing air of a terror she had not allowed herself to feel for 3 years. This was not a lost thing. This was a clue. The name echoed in her head now louder, clearer. Mr. Thompson. Not just any teacher. He had been the principal of Northgate High, the kind, compassionate principal who had addressed the student assembly with tears in his eyes after Amelia disappeared. The man who had personally assured Sarah that the school was doing everything it could. The man who had a box with her daughter's shoes in his abandoned storage locker. The drive home was a blur of rain-slicked roads and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, each sweep a heartbeat in the roaring silence of the car. Sarah had placed the box containing the shoes on the passenger seat, a sacred and terrible relic. She could not bring herself to look at it, but she could feel its presence, a cold spot in the warm air of the heater. Every traffic light, every turn, was punctuated by a single looping thought: Thompson. Why did Principal Thompson have Amelia's shoes? She parked in her driveway but did not move to get out. The house, her sanctuary of quiet sorrow, now seemed menacing. The truth she had both craved and feared for 3 years was no longer an abstract horror. It had a name, a face, and a potential location. It was coiled inside that cardboard box on the seat next to her. Her first instinct was to call Detective Miller, to drive straight to the station and slam the box onto his cluttered desk. But she hesitated. She remembered his face, the pity in his eyes that slowly hardened into professional detachment. He would ask questions. Where did you get these? A storage auction. Whose locker? A man named Thompson. Is there a chain of custody? What does that even mean? She could already hear the gentle dismissal in his voice. Another dead end. Another grieving mother grasping at straws. He would call it circumstantial. Coincidence. She needed more than just the shoes. She needed to understand. Her mind, foggy for so long, began to clear, sharpened by a terrifying new purpose. She carried the box inside, placed it on the kitchen table where Amelia had painted the sunflowers, and then she went to her laptop. The search engine blinked expectantly. She typed in Arthur Thompson, Northgate High. The results flooded the screen. There were articles from the local paper praising his leadership. Principal Thompson launches Northgate Cares charity drive. Read one headline from 5 years ago. There were photos of him at football games, cutting ribbons for new science labs, his smile broad and avuncular. He looked exactly as she remembered him. Tall, with a kind, weathered face and graying hair that gave him an air of distinction. He had retired 2 years ago, a year after Amelia vanished. The school website had posted a gushing tribute, full of quotes from students and teachers about his dedication. He was more than a principal. He was the heart of this school. One teacher was quoted as saying, Sarah's stomach twisted. The heart of the school. He had organized assemblies. He had walked these halls. He had known Amelia. He had spoken her name. She clicked through image after image, looking for a crack in the facade, a flicker of something monstrous behind the warm, smiling eyes. There was nothing. He looked like everyone's favorite principal, a pillar of the community. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was her sister. Sarah stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the ignore button. Karen would be her voice of reason, her anchor to reality. But right now, Sarah did not want reason. She wanted to dive headfirst into the abyss that had just opened up at her feet. Reluctantly, she answered. "Hey, you!" Karen's voice was warm, a familiar comfort. "How was the auction? Find any hidden treasures?" Sarah's own voice was a dry croak. "I found something." The tone was enough. Karen's cheerfulness vanished. "Sarah? What is it? What's wrong?" "I bought a unit. It was full of old stuff from the high school. Textbooks. Things like that." Sarah hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Karen, I found her shoes." Silence stretched across the line, thick and heavy. "What do you mean, her shoes?" Karen finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Amelia's shoes. The ones with the sunflowers. They were in a box." "Oh, Sarah." "No, it was a soft, mournful sound." "Are you sure? It's been a long time. Maybe they're just similar." "They're hers," Sarah said, her voice hardening with a certainty that surprised even her. "I'm holding them right now. I know them." She explained about the locker, whose it was. "It belonged to Principal Thompson." Another pause. "The principal?" "Sarah, that could mean anything. You said it had school supplies. Maybe there was a lost and found clear-out. A donation drive he was in charge of. There could be 100 logical explanations. 100 logical explanations that leave my daughter's shoes in a box in his abandoned storage unit for 3 years? The anger was a hot spike in her chest. Felt good. Felt better than the cold blanket of grief. "I'm just saying, be careful," Karen pleaded. Don't let yourself build a fantasy around this. You've been through so much. I don't want to see you get hurt again, chasing something that isn't there." The words were meant to be kind, but they felt like a dismissal, just like the one she feared from the police. They saw a fragile, grieving mother. They did not see the fire that had just been lit. "I have to go, Karen. I'll call you later." She hung up before her sister could reply. Karen was wrong. This was not a fantasy. This was a thread. The first solid thing she had been able to grasp in 3 years, and she would not let it go. She turned back to the laptop. She needed to find Arthur Thompson. His retirement announcement mentioned he was planning to stay in the area, to enjoy a quiet life of fishing and gardening. A quick search of public records gave her an address, a modest house on the other side of town, not 20 minutes from her own. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What was she going to do? Drive over there? Knock on his door? What would she even say? "Excuse me, you were my daughter's principal, and I just bought your old storage unit and found her shoes inside. Care to explain?" The absurdity of it was staggering. And yet, what was the alternative? To hand the shoes to Detective Miller and let them disappear into an evidence bag, filed away in a cold case file to gather more dust. No, she had to see his face when she asked him. She had to watch his eyes. She had to know. The man in the photographs smiled warmly at the camera, a picture of trustworthiness. But a man who keeps a missing girl's shoes in a box is not trustworthy. He is a monster hiding in plain sight. Sarah closed the laptop. She knew what she had to do. She would not call. She would not give him time to prepare. She would go to his house. She would stand on his doorstep. And she would ask him about the sunflowers. The gray afternoon light was fading as Sarah drove through unfamiliar neighborhoods. The houses grew larger, set back from the road behind manicured lawns and old-growth trees. Arthur Thompson lived on a quiet, dead-end street that felt insulated from the rest of the world. His house was a tidy, single-story ranch with a perfectly edged lawn and cheerful flower beds, now dormant for the winter. It was the picture of peaceful retirement. It made her feel sick. She parked across the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The box of shoes was on the floor of the passenger side, hidden from view but radiating a cold energy. For a long moment, she just sat there, watching the house. A light was on in the front window. He was home. This was a terrible idea. Karen's voice of caution echoed in her head. This was reckless. This was dangerous. But the image of the shoes, of Amelia's hand-painted sunflowers tucked away in the dark, pushed her forward. This was necessary. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car. The air was damp and cold, smelling of wet leaves. Each step on the pavement felt momentous, a step away from the passive grief of the last 3 years and into something active and terrifying. She walked up the stone pathway to his front door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She pressed the doorbell. The chime from inside was a pleasant, melodic sound. Footsteps approached. The door opened, and there he was. Arthur Thompson looked older than in the pictures, his face more deeply lined, but his eyes were the same, a clear, intelligent blue. He wore a cardigan and held a book, his finger marking his place. He looked at her with polite confusion. "Yes? Can I help you?" His voice was calm, cultured, the same voice that had offered condolences at a school assembly. Sarah's own voice was thin, unsteady. "Mr. Thompson? My name is Sarah Jensen. My daughter was Amelia." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a look of deep, practiced sympathy. His expression softened, his posture slumping slightly as if sharing the weight of her grief. "Mr. Jensen, of course. Please, come in." He stepped back, holding the door wide. The gesture was so disarming, so normal, that Sarah almost lost her nerve. But she remembered the box. She stepped inside. The house was immaculate, smelling of lemon polish and old books. It was warm and quiet. He led her to a living room with a stone fireplace and comfortable-looking armchairs. "Please have a seat," he said, his tone gentle. "This is quite a surprise. It's been some time. How are you holding up?" The question was so absurd she almost laughed. How was she holding up? She was a ghost haunting her own life. "I'm here because I have a question for you, Mr. Thompson." He sat in the chair opposite her, his expression patient and concerned. "Of course, my dear. Anything." Sarah's resolve hardened. "My dear," the casual paternalism of it grated on her raw nerves. "I was at a storage unit auction this weekend," she began, watching his face closely. "I bought a unit that was registered in your name. Unit 23B at Lock It Up Storage." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Not guilt, not fear, annoyance. It was there and gone in a second, replaced by a self-deprecating chuckle. "Oh heavens, that old thing. I completely forgotten about it. My late wife Eleanor, she handled the bills. After she passed, I'm afraid I let a few things slip. I suppose they finally auctioned it off." He shook his head, a wry smile on his face. "I hope you didn't pay too much. It was just a lot of old junk." "It was mostly junk," Sarah agreed, her voice flat. "Old textbooks, school supplies, and some donated items." She leaned forward slightly. "It looked like things from that old charity drive you used to run. The Northgate Cares Drive." He brightened, his smile becoming genuine. "That's the one. Yes, we collected items for families in need. Clothes, household goods. Some of it ended up in storage when we couldn't place it all right away. I always meant to get it to Goodwill. Life gets in the way, I suppose." He looked at her, his eyes full of that practiced sympathy again.
"I'm sorry, Mr. Jensen."
"I can see this is upsetting for you, dredging up old school memories. What was it you wanted to ask me?" This was it. The moment stretched, thin and taut. "I found a box of clothes in the unit," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "And in the box I found a pair of shoes, white sneakers, with sunflowers painted on them." She watched him. She watched every micro-movement in his face. His expression did not change. He held her gaze, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to place the memory. There was no jolt of recognition, no flash of fear, nothing. He just looked thoughtful. "Sunflowers," he repeated slowly. He shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't recall any specific pair of shoes. We had hundreds of donations come through over the years. Piles of clothes and shoes from the lost and found. It's impossible to remember one item. He offered her a small, sad smile. Were they Amelia's? He said her name so easily. It was like a physical blow. He was turning it back on her, making it about her grief, her desperate need to find connections. He was plausible. He was calm. He was everything a kind, retired principal should be. And he was lying. Sarah felt it with a certainty that was absolute. It wasn't in what he said, but what he didn't. There was no curiosity. A normal person would ask, "Her shoes? Are you sure? How could they have gotten there?" He asked no questions. He just provided a smooth, seamless explanation. A donation drive. A lost and found clear-out. A neat, tidy box to put her horror in. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice like ice. They were hers. She was wearing them the day she disappeared. He let out a long, slow sigh. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, looking at her with an expression of profound pity. "Mr. Jensen, Sarah, I can only imagine how painful this must be for you, to find something like that after all this time. It must feel significant, but you must understand, from my perspective, it was an anonymous donation. A pair of shoes in a box of other forgotten things." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Kids leave things behind all the time. A shoe gets misplaced in the locker room, it ends up in the lost and found, and at the end of the year it goes into a donation box. It's the most likely explanation. It's a sad coincidence, but it is just a coincidence." His calmness was the most terrifying thing about him. He was a wall of serene denial. She could throw the truth at him and it would just bounce off. She felt a wave of dizziness, the warmth of the room suddenly oppressive. She had what she came for, not a confession, but a confirmation. Her gut screamed that this man was hiding something terrible behind his kind eyes and gentle voice. She stood up abruptly. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson." He stood as well, a look of concern on his face. "Are you all right? You look pale. Can I get you a glass of water?" "I'm fine," she said, moving toward the door. "I have to go." He followed her, his hand hovering near her elbow as if to steady her. "Sarah," he said softly at the door, "for your own sake, I think you should let this go. Don't torture yourself by creating mysteries where there are only sad, simple answers." It was a warning, veiled in concern, but a warning nonetheless. Let it go. Forget what you found. She turned and looked him straight in the eye. "Some things can't be let go," she said. She walked back to her car, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He watched her from his doorway until she had closed the car door. He even gave her a small, sad wave. A wolf in sheep's clothing. The phrase repeated in her mind. He wasn't just lying. He was enjoying it. He was enjoying her pain, her confusion. The smooth, practiced performance was for his own benefit. The quiet street, the tidy house, the polite conversation. It was all a stage, and she had just stumbled into the middle of his play. Driving away, she looked in the rearview mirror. He was gone. The front door was closed, but she felt his eyes on her all the way to the main road. The hunt had just begun. The conversation with Thompson left Sarah feeling hollowed out and electrified at the same time. His placid, reasonable denial was more damning than any angry outburst would have been. It was too smooth, too practiced. It was a wall built to repel suspicion, and Sarah knew she had to find a way to tear it down, brick by brick. The shoes were the foundation, but they were not enough. She needed more. Back home, she laid out everything she knew, which was terrifyingly little. Fact 1. Thompson had Amelia's shoes. Fact 2. His explanation was plausible on the surface but felt profoundly wrong. Fact 3. He had retired a year after Amelia's disappearance. Coincidence? Or had he needed to get away from the place where he had committed an unspeakable crime? She went back to the old news articles about the Northgate Cares charity drive. She printed out the articles from 5 and 6 years ago. They mentioned the drive ran every autumn, from September to November, collecting winter coats and canned goods ahead of the holidays. Amelia had disappeared in late March. A pair of lightweight sneakers would not have been part of an autumn collection drive. More importantly, if they had been found in a locker room and swept into a donation bin at the end of the school year, that would have been in June, months after she vanished. Why would Thompson have taken personal possession of them and put them in his private storage? The timeline did not fit his story. It was a small crack, but it was a crack. Her next thought was to dig into Thompson himself. Retirement had suited him, he'd told the papers. Fishing and gardening. A quiet life. Felt like another performance. People like him, men who craved the authority and control of being a principal, did not just fade into quiet obscurity. Not without a reason. She spent the next 2 days in a state of feverish, secret activity. She called in sick to the library, the lie tasting metallic in her mouth. Her search history became a catalog of her obsession. Public property records, social media deep dives, old high school yearbooks. She found nothing scandalous. Arthur Thompson had been married for 40 years to a woman named Eleanor, a first-grade teacher who had passed away from cancer 2 years ago. No children. His digital footprint was almost non-existent. He had no social media profiles. He was a ghost online, a man who valued his privacy. Frustration gnawed at her. She felt like she was fighting a shadow. She needed to see him, to watch him, to find a deviation in his perfect, quiet routine. The thought was terrifying. This was not something she did. She was a librarian, a widow, a grieving mother. She was not a detective. But the image of Amelia's face, bright and laughing, propelled her forward. She had to do this. For her. The next morning, she drove back to Thompson's neighborhood and parked several houses down, in a spot where she had a clear view of his driveway but was unlikely to be noticed. She brought a thermos of coffee and a book she had no intention of reading. Felt insane, sitting there like a private investigator in a movie. The morning passed in a slow, mundane rhythm. A mail truck came and went. A neighbor walked a dog. At 10 o'clock, Thompson's garage door rolled open. He backed out in a clean, sensible sedan, the kind of car that blends into any parking lot. He was wearing a fishing vest. Her heart leaped. She started her car and followed him, staying 2 cars back, her pulse thrumming with anxiety. He drove calmly, obeying every speed limit. He went to a grocery store. Sarah waited in the parking lot, her mind racing. Was this his whole life? Groceries and fishing? Had she completely misjudged him? Was Karen right? He came out 20 minutes later with a single bag of groceries and drove home. Sarah followed, her hopes sinking. She watched him pull back into his garage. The rest of the day was a bust. He did not leave the house again. She went home feeling defeated and foolish. Maybe the shoes were a coincidence. Maybe he was just a tidy man who had forgotten about a storage unit. The doubt was a poison, seeping into the cracks of her resolve. That night, she took the shoes out of the box and held them. She traced the shape of the painted sunflowers, remembering the exact shade of yellow Amelia had mixed. This was real. Her daughter's shoes were in her hands. The doubt receded, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She would go back tomorrow. The next day, she was in position by sunrise. The routine was the same. The quiet street, the waiting. This time, however, when Thompson left just after noon, he was not wearing a fishing vest. He drove in a different direction, toward the highway that led out of town, east toward the mountains. Sarah followed, her adrenaline surging. This felt different. He drove for nearly an hour, leaving the suburbs behind for winding country roads flanked by dense pine forests. The sky was a low, heavy sheet of gray. Cell service became spotty, the blue dot of her location on the map app flickering and dying. She grew more and more tense with every mile that passed. Where was he going? He finally turned off the main road onto a narrow, unpaved lane marked with a faded, barely legible private road sign. Sarah pulled over to the shoulder before the turnoff, her heart pounding. She could not follow him down there. Her car would be too obvious. She killed the engine and waited. An hour passed, then another. The silence of the forest pressed in on her. There were no other cars, no signs of life. Just the dripping of rain from the towering trees. What was down that road? A fishing spot? A friend's cabin? Or something else? The not knowing was a physical agony. She was about to give up, to turn around and go home, when she saw his sedan coming back up the lane. He turned onto the highway, heading back toward town, and did not even glance in her direction. Sarah waited until he was out of sight, then made a split-second decision. She turned down the private road herself, her tires crunching on the wet gravel. The lane was rough, winding deeper into the woods for about a half-mile before ending in a small, muddy clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated, single-story structure. It was not a cabin. It looked more like an old, windowless maintenance shed or a hunting outpost, its gray paint peeling, a rusted padlock on its only door. A larger, newer-looking padlock was fastened next to the old one. A thicket of overgrown blackberry bushes crowded one side of the building. There was no other sign of life, just the silent, brooding forest. Sarah got out of her car, the air cold and sharp. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. This place felt wrong, felt sick. It was a place for secrets. She walked around the perimeter of the small building. There were no windows. The only entrance was the single, heavily locked door. On the ground near the door, half trampled into the mud, was a small, bright object. She bent down and picked it up. It was a plastic hair clip, shaped like a pink butterfly. It was new, the kind of thing a teenage girl would wear. Her blood ran cold. This was not a fishing cabin. This was not a hunting shack. She looked at the two padlocks on the door. One old and rusted, one new and gleaming. Why two locks? Why a place so remote, so hidden? Suddenly, she saw him. Not in person, but in her mind's eye. She saw Thompson, the kind principal, bringing another girl here. A girl who wore butterfly clips in her hair. The thought was so vivid, so horrifying, that she stumbled back, gasping for air. The danger was not in the past. It was not just about Amelia. It was happening now. The new padlock, the fresh tire tracks in the mud. He was not just visiting an old, forgotten property. He was actively using it. The butterfly clip felt like a burning coal in her palm. This was the point of no return. This was more than suspicion. This was evidence. This was a place. She scrambled back to her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the ignition. She had to call the police. She had to call Detective Miller. She could not go to him with just a pair of shoes and a gut feeling. But with this, a secret, isolated building owned by the man who had her daughter's shoes, a place he was still visiting, a place where a young girl's hair clip lay in the mud. With this, maybe he would finally listen. She fumbled for her phone, praying she had enough signal to make the call that would change everything. The call to Detective Miller was the hardest one Sarah had ever made. She sat in her car on the side of the remote highway, her voice trembling as she tried to piece together the fragmented horror of her last few days. She spoke of the storage locker, the shoes, the smarmy denial from Thompson, following him, the secluded building, the new padlock, and finally, the butterfly hair clip clutched in her sweaty palm. Miller was silent on the other end for a long time. Sarah could picture him at his desk, rubbing his tired eyes, listening to what must have sounded like the rambling paranoia of a grief-stricken parent. "Mr. Jensen," he said finally, his voice heavy with skepticism but lacking the immediate dismissal she had feared. "You followed him? You went onto private property? You realize how this sounds?" "I know how it sounds," Sarah pleaded, desperation making her voice sharp. "But you didn't see it, Detective. You didn't see the place. It's wrong. Something is wrong out there. He's not just gardening. He's hiding something." "A hair clip isn't a crime," Miller said, but there was a flicker of something new in his tone. Not belief, but professional obligation. "Okay, give me the location. The address of the turnoff." Sarah gave him the details, her words tumbling over one another. He told her to go home, to not go back there, to not contact Thompson. "Let us handle it, Mr. Jensen." We'll run the property records. Maybe send a patrol car to do a drive-by. But you need to stay out of it. Do you understand? She agreed, but the promise felt hollow. Going home felt like an act of surrender. Every instinct screamed that time was running out for whoever had lost that butterfly clip. But she had done what she could. She had passed the baton. Now she could only wait. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Hours bled into a day, then two. She heard nothing. She resisted the urge to call Miller's office a dozen times an hour. She paced her house, the silence amplifying her fears. Did he believe her? Had they even gone out there? Or had her frantic call been dismissed and filed away? On the third day, the dam of her patience broke. She could not wait any longer. She had to know. Convinced the police had done nothing, she made a reckless decision. She would go back. Not to the property itself, but to Thompson's house. She did not know what she would do when she got there. Maybe just watch, maybe look for another clue, anything to quiet the screaming in her head. As she drove toward his neighborhood in the late afternoon, a drizzle started to fall, blurring the world outside her windshield. As she turned onto his street, her heart seized. There was a car in his driveway, one she did not recognize. It was a plain, dark sedan. As she got closer, she saw a young woman get out of the passenger side. She looked to be in her late teens with long, dark hair. She was laughing at something the driver had said. Then, the driver's door opened. It was Thompson. He came around the car, a benevolent smile on his face, and placed a hand on the small of the girl's back, guiding her toward the front door. Sarah slammed on her brakes, her car skidding slightly on the wet pavement. It was happening, right now, in front of her eyes. This was not a memory. This was not a theory. This was a girl, alive and breathing, being led into that house by that man. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the girl was in terrible danger. Panic, pure and undiluted, flooded her system. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers thick and clumsy. She did not call Miller. There was no time for explanations or skepticism. She dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Sarah Jensen, she said, her voice a choked whisper. I'm at 124 Willow Creek Lane, the house of Arthur Thompson. He just brought a teenage girl here. I think he's going to hurt her. I think he's the man who took my daughter, Amelia Jensen, 3 years ago. You have to send someone. Right now. She poured out the story again, this time with the frantic energy of a witness to an imminent crime. The dispatcher, sensing the genuine terror in her voice, kept her on the line, her calm, professional questions a stark contrast to Sarah's panicked breathing. Ma'am, are you in a safe location? Can you see the house? Yes, I'm in my car. They went inside. Police are on their way, ma'am. The address you gave for the property in the woods, was that Arthur Thompson's property? I don't know. I just know he went there. Suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with shocking speed. Not just one, but several. They were closer than she'd expected. Far closer. A patrol car, then another, screeched onto the quiet suburban street, lights flashing, shattering the afternoon peace. They were followed by an unmarked car that pulled up directly behind Sarah's. Detective Miller got out. He strode over to her window, his face grim and set. I told you to stay home, Mr. Jensen. He brought a girl here, she cried, pointing at the house. She's in there with him. We know, Miller said, his voice low and intense. We ran the property records on that shed. It's not in his name. It belongs to a holding company that traces back to 2 other men. One of them is a former Northgate gym teacher who resigned right after your daughter went missing. We've had Thompson under surveillance since your call. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw not pity, but a shared, grim purpose. Your call just moved up our timeline. Now stay here. He left her and joined a team of uniformed officers who were taking positions around Thompson's house. One officer hammered on the front door, shouting, Police! Open the door. Sarah watched, her breath held, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The quiet, manicured facade of Arthur Thompson's life was being ripped apart. There was no response from inside the house. After a few tense moments, the officers used a battering ram, the door splintering inwards with a sickening crunch. They swarmed inside, guns drawn. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Sarah could hear her own blood pounding in her ears. Then, a muffled shout from inside. A moment later, 2 officers emerged, half carrying the teenage girl Sarah had seen earlier. She was weeping, her face pale with shock. They put her in the back of a squad car. More officers appeared, and between them was Arthur Thompson. The mask was gone. The benevolent, kindly principal had vanished, replaced by a man with dead eyes and a face contorted in a sneer of pure hatred. He saw Sarah in her car, and his eyes locked on hers. There was no denial in them now, only a chilling, bottomless malice. They put him in a separate car and drove him away. Miller walked back over to her, his face pale. "We were too late for the other one," he said, his voice rough. Sarah's heart stopped. "What other one?" "The property in the woods," he said, his gaze distant. "We sent a team there as soon as we established the link. There's a hidden room, a cellar beneath the floor." He took a deep, shaky breath. "We found your daughter, Mr. Jensen. Amelia. We found her remains." The world dissolved into a smear of flashing lights and rain. The sound in her ears was a high, keening wail, and it took her a long moment to realize it was coming from her own throat. It was over. The searching, the wondering, the not knowing. It was all over. And the truth was a horror far beyond anything her grief had ever allowed her to imagine. The shoes were not just a clue. They were a trophy. And the monster who had kept them had been living just down the road all along. Section The world after the sirens faded was a muted, colorless place. Sarah found herself in a small, sterile room at the police station, a cup of lukewarm coffee untouched on the table in front of her. The shock had wrapped her in a layer of emotional cotton, insulating her from the full force of the reality that had just crashed down. Amelia was gone. For 3 years, that had been a terrifying possibility, a black hole in the center of her life. Now it was a fact, sharp and jagged and irreversible. Detective Miller came in and sat across from her. The weariness in his face seemed to have settled into his bones, but his eyes held a new respect when he looked at her. "The girl from the house is safe," he said quietly. "Her name is Chloe. She's 17. Thompson approached her at a coffee shop, told her he was starting a scholarship fund in honor of a former student, offered to interview her for it. He was a master at this. He used his old reputation like a key to unlock their trust. Sarah just nodded, unable to form words. A scholarship, in honor of a former student. The sickness of it was breathtaking. "He's not talking," Miller continued. "But we don't need him to. Chloe's testimony is clear. And what we found at that property. It's a long story, Sarah. A very ugly 1-inch." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Thompson wasn't working alone. The gym teacher, a man named Peterson, and a third man, a local businessman who funded the operation. They used that place for years. They targeted vulnerable girls. Runaways, kids from troubled homes, kids they identified at school. They used Thompson's authority to lure them in. The scope of it, the organized depravity, was something her mind could not fully grasp. It was not one monster. It was a nest of them. "Amelia wasn't like the others," Miller said, his voice softening. "From what we've pieced together," she fought back. "Peterson tried to grab her after her basketball practice that morning. She wasn't supposed to be there alone, but her friend got sick and didn't show up. It was an opportunity. But Amelia," she fought him. Hard. Thompson was there. He intervened. Miller's voice faltered. He panicked. In the struggle, she fell. She hit her head. It wasn't their plan to kill her. Their sick game was about control, not murder. But her death forced them to change everything. They buried her under the floor of that cellar and swore each other to secrecy. Thompson's retirement, Peterson's resignation, it was all damage control. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes dry and burning. "The shoes," she whispered. "Why did he keep the shoes?" Miller shook his head slowly. "A trophy. A reminder. A piece of his power over her, over the secret. We found other things in the house. Small, personal items from other girls. Some we have open missing person files on. Your daughter's case is going to break open at least 4 others." The thought brought no comfort. Only a deeper, more profound wave of sorrow for the other families, the other girls. Each one a life stolen or shattered by these men who had hidden behind masks of respectability. Later, a gentle-voiced trauma counselor led her to another room. Through the window, she could see the girl, Chloe, wrapped in a blanket, speaking with her parents who were clinging to her as if she were a ghost. The girl looked up and her eyes met Sarah's through the glass. There was a universe of terror in that gaze, but also something else. A flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. An unspoken acknowledgement that Sarah's fight had, in some small, miraculous way, become her rescue. The formal processes of the law took over. Thompson, Peterson, and their accomplice were charged. The media descended, their headlines screaming the lurid details of the principal's secret cellar. The story of the grieving mother who found the shoes and cracked the case was a footnote in the larger, more sensational narrative. And that was fine with Sarah. She had not done it for headlines. The truth, when it was finally laid bare in a courtroom months later, was even uglier than Miller had described. The rescued girl, Chloe, and another survivor who came forward after the arrests, testified to the systematic psychological abuse, the manipulation, the cold, calculated cruelty of the men who had presented themselves as mentors and benefactors. Thompson was the ringleader, the charming face of the operation, while Peterson was the muscle. They had operated for nearly a decade, a hidden cancer in the heart of the community. During the trial, Arthur Thompson sat impassively, his face a blank mask of indifference. He never looked at Sarah. He never showed a flicker of remorse. It was only when the judge handed down his sentence, life without the possibility of parole, that his composure finally broke. A flash of that same pure, cold hatred she had seen in his driveway crossed his face before he was led away. He was a monster to the very end. Section in the quiet months that followed the trial, the blanket of grief returned, but its texture had changed. It was no longer thick and suffocating. It was thinner now, more like a well-worn shawl, heavy with the weight of memory but no longer blinding. The not knowing had been a special kind of hell. The knowing was just a different kind. It was a landscape of sharp edges and permanent scars, but it was a solid place. She could finally stand on firm ground. She sold the house that held too many ghosts and moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. She packed Amelia's room herself, each object a story, a memory she folded carefully and placed in a box labeled Sunshine, the shoes. However, she could not pack away. They sat on her new mantelpiece, a testament not to the horror, but to the fierce, unbreakable love of the girl who had painted them. They were a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, Amelia had fought. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the arrest, her phone rang. It was Chloe's mother. Chloe was graduating high school. She was going to college. She wanted to be a social worker, and she had asked if Sarah would come to her graduation party. Sarah hesitated. She had avoided contact, not wanting to be a living reminder of the trauma Chloe had endured. But her mother insisted. "She wants you there," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "She says you're the reason she's here at all." So Sarah went. The party was in a bright, sunny backyard filled with balloons and laughter. When Chloe saw her, she broke away from her friends and walked over. She was taller than Sarah remembered, her face filled with a new, hard-won confidence. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet strength. They stood together in a quiet corner of the yard, the sounds of the party a distant murmur. "I never got to thank you," Chloe said, her voice soft but steady, "for not looking away." "I did it for my daughter," Sarah said, the words catching in her throat. "I know," Chloe replied, and she reached out and briefly squeezed Sarah's hand. "But you did it for me, too." In that moment, standing in the warm sunlight, Sarah felt a profound shift inside her. The gaping hole left by Amelia's absence would never be filled. The pain would always be a part of her. But it was no longer the only part. Looking at this brave young woman, at the future that had been so nearly stolen from her, Sarah understood that her long, terrible journey through the darkness had not just been about finding an ending to her own story. It had been about allowing another one to begin. The grief was real. The loss was permanent. But in the courage to face the unthinkable, to listen to the whispers of intuition against the roar of doubt, she had found more than just the truth. She had found a purpose. Her love for her daughter had not ended with her daughter's life. It had transformed, reaching across an impossible divide to save another. And in that, there was a kind of peace, a glimmer of light that the darkness could never truly extinguish.